Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of A Cup of Joe. My name is Joe Escobedo, and with me on the show today is Ruo Mei Chua. Thanks for being on the show, Ruo Mei.
You're most welcome. I have my cup of Joe here as well.
Awesome. So Ruo Mei is the Chief Impact Officer at SUTW Impact Consulting. And what does the SUTW stand for, Ruo Mei?
It actually stands for Smiling Up the World, which is the reason why I started this more than 4 years back.
Awesome.
In fact, I have a little catchphrase. It stands for Smiling Up the World, a person at a time, a smile each time.
Wow, okay. There's a lot of smiling, and I think it very much fits who you are. I mean, we've known each other for a while since you've been at the Halogen Foundation, and literally every time I meet you, you're always smiling. So I think that makes that makes perfect sense. Now, in terms of what you're up to now, can you just share a little bit of what you've been doing? You mentioned kind of working with startups and pitching and things like that, but what's been keeping you busy?
Yeah, so you're right. On the surface, when people look at what I do, they see that I'm doing career coaching and consulting. On the careers front, they see that I'm working with a lot of startups on pitching. They see that I might be working with corporates and organizations on their individual brand storytelling. So it seems like a whole bunch of stuff. But how I really explain it is the red thread that runs through it is helping my clients, whether startups, individuals, brands, or organizations, articulate their value and what they bring to the table in a clear and hopefully interesting manner. And that applies to interviews as well, because ultimately you're pitching yourself to be taken up as a person of value in that organization you hope to join.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense because it's applicable to so many different, roles and industries. You talked about whether you're pitching yourself for a job, or you're pitching to investors, or you're pitching internally for additional buy-in, your agency pitching to clients. I mean, it's applicable to literally every type of role there is. So I think that's what we'll spend the majority of today's session on, is really understanding and getting your tips in terms of pitching.
Sure.
So I think we'll start maybe from an entrepreneurial perspective. You know, if you're pitching to investors, you're pitching to partners. And one of the things you talked about is showcasing or articulating their unique values. So how do you even get to that point of even identifying the values before you start articulating them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joe. I think you're right. Before we can pitch something, you need to know what you're pitching and what makes you different. I think a few questions you want to start running through your mind first is, I assume that, let's say, the person knows what they want to pitch, whether it's a product or service or themselves as an entrepreneur today. What problem are they trying to get solved, and what is so frustrating about the current ways they have been trying to solve those problems? So pain points and gaps in the incumbents, as we call them. And then you ask yourself, okay, where do I potentially fit in as a solution? And how do I fix those pain points and maybe plug those gaps better or more viably for the customer? So I think first and foremost is all about them first, the customer you're facing. Because while your product is the same, I mean, the pitch is going to be different, isn't it? And even the same product, think about your mobile phone. I mean, I'm an Android user for my phone, Mac from my app or from my computer. But from my phone, I've heard that for different markets, like Vietnam, for example, Joe, you might be familiar, they sell different versions, right? Samsung A, for example, they wouldn't sell the Galaxy series. And that comes from first knowing the customer, then knowing their price point and their willingness and ability to pay and what they need, what they don't need. That part is important as well. Then you pitch something that really fits their needs and their requirements. That was a long answer, but I hope that kind of answers your question partially, at least.
No, absolutely. I want to dig a bit deeper into that, because I think it's something we continually, talk about in this series, is really understanding your audience and your customer. So I'd love to hear from your point of view, what are some ways in which you work with organizations or entrepreneurs to better understand who is the audience?
There's a really nifty tool that we use in startups that I think most of you might have heard of. It's called the Value Proposition Canvas. Now, some of you might be more familiar with the Lean Canvas or the Business Model Canvas. The Value Proposition Canvas actually plugs into it under the value circle, the customer circle. And why I think that's such a beautiful tool is because it compels you to think in terms of what Harvard Business School professor, now the late Clayton Christensen, had said. What are the jobs to be done of your customers? So that's the first. There are two tools here. First is Value Proposition Canvas, and what plugs into it is what we call jobs to be done. And the thing is that, Joe, let me give you an example that maybe all of us can relate to. Have you ever bought a bag that was worth more than, say, $200
A
or a
bag that
wallet?
was for
Yeah,
my wife, yes. For me, no.
Virgil. The guys always blame it on the wives.
Yeah.
Huh? So let's say your wife, okay, so your wife
Yeah.
has bought a bag. Let's say it cost her 300 USD. Now
Hmm.
let me ask you, what is the functional job of the bag? What's the functional purpose of a bag?
Yes, to carry her personal items to work and just around town. That's it.
Absolutely. So with a $5 bag, if it's PVC, really strong, large enough, many compartments, would it do the functional job as well of
Yes.
carrying things?
Same.
So clearly she's not really buying it. I mean, you wish that she would buy the $5 bag, but
Yeah.
clearly she has other reasons. So let's
Yes.
move on to the other jobs, the other purposes that that $300 bag is fulfilling. How about emotional? When we talk about emotional jobs to be done of our customers, it's about how consuming that product or service makes them feel about themselves. How do they feel as a result of consuming that product or service? What do you think that bag does for your wife in this case?
I mean,
Emotionally.
it makes her quite happy, at least for a little bit.
It makes her happy. What else? If it's a brand that people recognize, maybe.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to, feels like that prestige factor and, elevating some kind of social status or whatever that may be.
Absolutely. So then social is the last part of it. We talked about functional, then
Mm.
emotional, then social jobs to be done. And social is how we want to be seen by the people around us, whether peer or bosses or
Mm.
otherwise, or larger society as a result of consuming that product and service. And you can apply this lens to everything that you are selling or pitching, whether it's a job, whether it's a product like a phone or a bag or a wallet, or it's a service, even an app, for example, right?
Mm.
Or the service of having someone come and clean your house. I mean, can you do the job yourself? Sure. But maybe there are more things like emotionally, someone cleaning it for you gives you convenience. It removes hassle, removes stress. And I kind of want to encourage our audience here today to think about the order. It's not always functional, then emotional or social.
Mm.
Sometimes you would notice that the more people pay for a certain premium product, like the
Mm.
branded goods, sometimes people are actually incentivized to pay more of their market value because of the emotional and social jobs. But you know what's the trick, Joe?
Mm.
Just like when we ask your wife, she'll probably never tell us straight off it's because she wants to look like she belongs to a certain class. Most
Exactly.
people will not, right? Most people will not admit to the emotional and social jobs. So it is our job to then kind of go through the usual design thinking thing where you actually observe, you might have to infer, you might have to interview from oblique angles to kind of get that piece of that puzzle clarified. But this is so important. This is a tool I use myself. This is a tool I get most of my clients to use, and they find it very helpful to keep that framing in place. And the rest of the value proposition canvas is then about, of course, pain points, gain points, and then matching what you have to offer to those. So that part is pretty standard.
So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I've heard a lot of the kind of rational versus emotional. So you call it the functional versus emotional and social. I think one thing that I hadn't really thought about, but still makes a big difference, is the social element. Now I'm going to switch gears a bit, and let's say, because a lot of my clients are Fortune 500 companies, they're enterprises. Um,
That's right.
for them, a lot of the times it is, they pick a partner because um, it has an impact in terms of their own kind of reputation within the organization. So, obviously they did a good job. They picked a good partner. They look great. They get promoted, et cetera, et cetera. But as you were saying, I think it's slightly easier to get the emotional and rational to some extent. How do you really
Mhm.
unearth the social one? Because that's, I think, that's the most difficult one to really figure out.
That's a good follow-up question. I think you might work backwards, for example, from, of course, you can get hold of their KPIs. That would be great
Mm.
because in the KPIs, it would reveal what incentivizes them, right? What do they want to perform well in? Is it, for example, being seen as a boss who's very nurturing, who's very collaborative, who nurtures and develops the talents under them? If that's the case, then you can bet almost for sure that there's going to be a social part of the job where they want to do things that can profile and frame themselves in a way that is seen as being nurturing and developmental. I mean, of course,
Mm.
we hope that bosses do not do it just for self-interest, but the truth is there is a good segment of bosses that do that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be realistic and know that. So first, if you can get hold of their KPIs and their balanced scorecard. That's one way to reverse engineer it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Do you agree? A second way is probably to look at what members of the organization, so even if it's not explicitly in, say, the vice president's scorecard, if the boss of that organization talks a lot about philanthropy or giving back to society or raising the next generation of leaders in LinkedIn or in their annual reports, for example, then again, when you sell to customers within the organization, you also want to slide that in because that's probably top of mind as well. If they want to look good and echo that same refrain of their bosses publicly. Yeah, I would say those things, and of course, go do LinkedIn research, at least on the very person you're pitching to. Look through their posts, especially if they're set to public. And again, look, how do they like to frame themselves? If they frame themselves a particular way, like I'm nurturing, I always give young people a chance. Then, I recently heard a videographer. Now, the average age of his team is about 22 years old, very young videography teams. But he gets Fortune 500 clients. Probably some of your clients are his clients. And he has, he has a baby face. So I asked him, hey, how did you get the jobs? How do you convince these Fortune 500 big boys to give you a job? Because video is very important, especially when it's a corporate profiling video. Yeah. And he says, you know what? It's precisely because I look like this that my clients told me they give me this job because they pride themselves on being someone that gives the younger generation a good chance. So that's quite illuminating, right? We almost think that something that's a disadvantage in this case has become a competitive advantage, but certainly it's not just the functional work, there's the emotional, how that person wants to feel about themselves for awarding this contract, and the social, how they want to be seen as a result. Especially if the video is really good, they can then do a follow-up LinkedIn post and say, really glad to partner with this young team that's been fantastic. And as a company, we believe in working with young talents and giving them a chance. So those are, yeah, I would say those are the little ways we can get about it.
No, I think those are some beautiful examples. And I think gave me some food for thought in terms of dyeing my hair and shaving. So I bring back my baby face.
No,
so
I think,
young professionals. Yeah, they're gonna take care of this.
I try to do the reverse, actually, ironically. I try to look a bit older because Asians generally look younger than we really are. And
it's true.
Except in some of those cases, like I mentioned, some others, are still pretty traditional in their perceptions.
Yeah. No, I think it's a beautiful explanation that kind of defies kind of the rational thinking in terms of why they work with them. And there's a beautiful nugget, which I learned from actually a financial company, is in terms of analyzing, it talks about the annual reports, the CEO statements. Those give you a very good indication because, like you said, everyone ideally wants to appease the CEO or the leadership team. It's some way. So it's the best way in terms of connecting with them and understanding their own values without kind of unearthing that. So I think that is a super tip, which I haven't shared publicly. I'm glad you brought it up because I wasn't going to do it. So.
Well, I'm happy to be your mouthpiece. We didn't sing this up at all, by the way. And I guess a more explicit way is to look at hashtags from the organization. Hashtags are very revealing, right? They are short and crisp and succinct way of how people in that organization want to brand themselves. And sometimes there are recurring organizational hashtags. So that would also be another clue on LinkedIn, especially.
All right, you got me thinking now. Because if the company is using the hashtags, this probably goes back to their own values, or at least it's something that has to get approved by multiple departments. So if either it's comms and it's branding, it's by the leadership team. So you're kind of ticking all those boxes. So once again, something I hadn't thought about. I mean, I use hashtags all the time, but reverse engineering it to research your audience, I think is an incredibly smart idea. So I'm taking notes as well on my phone. I think those are beautiful examples. Like I said, I think at this point we have a very clear understanding of the functional, kind of the emotional, and the social. Now, once you have that better understanding, how do you go about articulating it? Is there a certain style, a certain format? What do you recommend for clients?
Yeah, I think it really depends, again, on who they're pitching to and what their practical constraints are. So is this a closed door meeting? Is this a public pitch, for example? Is this, how much time do you have? How senior are the people in the room? What is the prior work that has been done already? The context, understanding what has gone prior. what has been tried that's similar to what you're pitching that they have tried before. How long ago was that attempt? What was the feedback from that attempt? What went well and what didn't go so well? And what are they afraid of, the risk factors? So I think that amount of information is very necessary so that you can then articulate a pitch. And I think rule of thumb is, let's say we have 60 minutes in the pitch closed door. I think we all know this as business people. We try and keep it to 15, 20 minutes where you're kind of doing your presentation. And even before that selling, you want to start off by saying, hey, this meeting was fixed 3 months ago or 3 weeks ago. I would like to check, has anything changed since then? I think checking in to see, especially in times like this, where a week, you can have a month's worth of changes happen in a week today, or even a day. I think it's important for us to check in to say, hey, is the agenda still the same? Are your pain points and your concerns and your needs still the same, or has something new or different emerged? Before you kind of launch into the presentation, we should take no more than a third of your allotted time. Then kind of open up to that Q&A. But as to how to pitch, again, a few guiding questions, right? Going back to firstly, what is the problem they're trying to solve? Ask yourself and pitch it to them. What are the consequences if you do not solve this problem effectively or efficiently? Because sometimes people only look at the short-term cost of the solution. Say you're buying a software, a data integration software. And they will say, oh, this is going to cost me $500,000. So that's cost upfront. But what they need to hear from your pitch is, now, if you do not invest this $500,000, right, this is going to, because you have data leaks, because your data is sitting in silos and not talking to each other, you're not monetizing on it, you're going to lose potential customers, market share, new talents, and so on. And that's actually going to cost you a cumulative amount of $5 million over the next 3 years. So kind of doing the ROI comparison for them, that's your job as a good pitcher, to draw their attention away from the immediate nuts and bolts to the potential gain, and more importantly, the potential losses that they will incur. And that's psychologically proven by science. They call it the loss aversion theory, which I'm sure, Joe, you're very familiar with.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think one of my previous participants summed it up perfectly. He said people don't buy medicine usually when they're feeling good, like supplements. They usually buy it when they're in some kind of pain. That's when they need it immediately.
Absolutely.
So I think it goes back to what you're saying, the pain versus gain, and emphasizing on one. One thing,
maybe, Joe, if I could.
Yeah, please.
So I was going to just complete my set of questions, because we started off with kind of what's their problem and why is it so painful for them? What is in it for them? I think that reframe, what's in it for me, of course, the me here is the customer, needs to be front and center. Potential gains, and we're going to help you avert potential losses. Then the next logical question is, what's your solution and how is it better than my incumbents? So this presupposes that we know how they're trying to solve the problem today. And when you talk about your competitors, there are two kinds, right? There are the traditional competitors that might be more manual, like paper filing, for example. Then there are the modern ones, software like yourself, but what's not so good about them? What are the gaps in them? So you have to answer it on two dimensions. Your traditional competitors, and then your modern competitors as well, so to speak. And then finally, oftentimes, and we know this having worked with organizations, it's a judgment call. I'm making a bet on you, the person, and you, the team. So you got to convince us, why you? How can you pull this off? What other companies have you done this for already? Leveraging credibility. You as a team, what's your past track record to say that you've done something, successfully, and what are your metrics of success? And I think if you can answer all of this in a pitch, whether it's a 3-minute, 5-minute, or 20-minute pitch, then I would say you're down pat. And of course, you supplement it with your case studies and your facts. But those are, I would say, are the very core questions that you want to have helped your customer understand, and you should have answered those through your pitch in one way or another.
Yeah, no, so I think that makes perfect sense. It's simple, but yet powerful questions. What I'd really love to get your thoughts on is, because we're in somewhat of a similar space in kind of the training and education space, in different topics, but the ROI one, how do you showcase that in something that is not, could be a longer term, maybe ROI, or could be something that's a bit more difficult to quantify. So how do you get around that? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, again, it depends on context. I think for, let's say I'm pitch coaching some of my startups, usually I only get 1 or 2 sessions with them. And so the immediate effect is I often have people come back to me to say, especially when they saw them at the start of their journey before any pitch training. And then after a demo day, they say, wow, even before demo day, after going through your sessions, we can see a 360-degree change in the clarity and the narrative that they're telling. So that's kind of immediate ROI, right? Where people can see, touch, feel, and experience it. But you're right, when it comes to, say, training, some other things that are, and interviews as well, that's also another immediate ROI thing that you can measure before and after. But I think when it comes to, for example, one type of training I do might be conflict management, or might be values identification as to what matters to you and how do you align your daily decisions along with that. Now that is something that's very longitudinal, right, Joe?
Yes, exactly.
And so many contamination factors, right? You may have done a good job and they may have internalized it, but when push comes to shove, maybe their hands are tied in a situation by their bosses or by their peers or by SOPs in the company. So I think over there, it's our job as trainers to manage the expectations of our clients. To say that, look, in a 4-hour training or a 2-day training, this is what we can do for you. This is what's measurable, right? However, if you want sustainable results, then maybe we will need to plan booster or check-in sessions, like 2 months down. We might have nudges complementing it with AI, for example, or email nudges or surveys. But again, I think a lot of that goes back to organizational will and budget. Oftentimes you will hear clients say, I don't have the budget to do this, or we don't have the time, we are very pressed for time. In which case, after we do our best, we say, okay, then with the practical constraints that we have, this is what we can do to kickstart the process. How about, for example, I work with your internal coaches so that we can create this momentum, sustain the momentum of change. But pretty much from that point on, it's down to you, right? So that it's a lot more internal capacity building and more sustainable for you from a financial as well as a time point of view. So I think, it really just boils down to managing expectations, being very realistic about what we can do, what we can measure, and what we cannot because of what we are not able to do in the long term with them due to some practical constraints.
Yeah, no, so very good points. I want to get through both of them, one of which was the internal coaching, which I want to get to later, so I don't forget. The other is in terms of setting expectations. And this is something I've been doing a little bit better than before in terms of like helping them understand a one-off versus a series. So for example, what the objective of one-off is to, enlighten them to change their thinking. But in order to implement, real action, it usually takes, like you said, a series of sessions or check-ins such that you can see the behavioral change versus a one-off and expecting them to do a whole 360-degree change.
One more thing to add was accountability partners. That's a free tool that's very effective. What I sometimes make my clients do is sign an accountability statement or declaration almost, and they have to actually, in class itself, they have to say, I pledge to these actions that they said they would do, and they have to sign it, take a photo of it, or email it across to somebody that they respect. And that's important, somebody they respect. Ideally, it's someone within the organization if it's a work context, because then person can kind of keep an eye on, are you following up on these KPIs and these pledges, right? Why that you respect? We all want to look good in front of people that we respect because we want them to think well of us. And we actually make them do it in class so that there's no backing off afterwards.
No, I think it's an excellent idea. I think I've tried that in the past, or at least I've seen organizations that have tried in the past. I'm keen to see if people actually execute it on it. That's the other thing. Like a lot of times they're very excited in this session, but a lot of times that's always the tough part.
So then you can gamify it a little bit. Now, of course, this boils down to how willing, right, and game your participants are. But if they're willing to go the whole way, I would even say, guys, make it hurt. What would be an amount of money or a time exchange that hurts? So for example, they would say, hi, accountability partner, I give you permission that if I fail to reach this target or this KPI or this pledge, for every day that I don't hit it or every percentage I don't hit it, I'm going to give you $100 into your account, no questions asked, and you're not allowed to return it to me. Right now, for some people, they're super rich, 100 is not painful enough, make it a 500, 1,000, whatever it is that hurts. If you're seriously committed to making a change. Now, for some people, it's not money. Maybe it's time. right? That in exchange, you have to do something. Maybe you're very good at designing slides. And in exchange, if you don't hit a pledge, the other guy can solicit X amount of time from you to finish a slide deck for them. Whatever it is that hurts, there needs to be a stake involved in this exchange and this accountability partner practice.
I love it. Yeah. Like I said, I'll have to consider doing that in my upcoming sessions, but it makes sense, like you said, to keep the momentum going. Another thing that I want to touch on is you talked about coaching the internal coaches, if I heard that correctly. So for example, tell me a bit more about that, because it sounds quite fascinating.
Yeah, so it's actually nothing new as a model. We call it train the trainer model externally. So internally, it might be, so for example, if you wanted to roll out coaching as a system, you wanted to teach people to be better coaches. Ideally, let's say at the end of the day, they want to develop 100 coaches within the organization. Now, it is not realistic that we can handhold every single one of these 100 coaches at the bottom of the pyramid. So what we do is we might maybe work with the top 10, right? Intermediate layer. It's almost like multi-level marketing, you know. Yeah. But we don't like that term, but you know, the intermediate level of 10 overseeing coaches or head coaches. And what we can do with them is maybe, for example, if the head coach's job is to come up with a structure so their junior coaches can follow. Because a lot of junior coaches stumble with, for example, if there's awkward silence or people are not prepared or they don't seem very willing to open up, what do I do? How do I structure a session so it's constructive? All of that nitty-gritty, from structure, the content, to delivery, to rapport building, to the soft skills, to breaking the ice, all of that. We can train the head coaches in a structured fashion to be able to then go down to their junior coaches and impart that level of insight and training. So it's very kind of the typical train the trainer model. But again, I want to emphasize it all boils down to political will of that organization and the client that we're working with.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and also, like I said, the workforce as well. If it's what I've realized is that works if it's a scalable model. So for example, if they have, 20, 30, 40 coaches, then it's one of those things, it's an easier thing to sell in because the scale is there, versus if they only have like 2 or 3 and you're trying to say charge, a couple $1,000s, for example, probably more than that.
And it's capacity building as well, because when you train coaches, you're benefiting your coachees, but I think it's also part of their talent retention, talent development plans. And yet another thing they can shout about in their annual reports and their hashtags, like we spoke about earlier. So it's very multi-pronged in terms of the benefits to the organization, where we sell the train the trainer model or train your internal coaches model.
Brilliant. I think these are excellent points. There's one more question I want to get your thoughts on before we go, is how important do you think it is that the audience knows the person who's pitching before the event? So how much does that perception, that either personal brand or corporate brand, dictate the level of success they have? So for example, if I found that if people already know me on LinkedIn and I am in a conversation with them where I'm pitching, I'm not really pitching, it's more of a conversation, versus if I'm going to someone who's never met me and I'm trying to go through what I've done, obviously the likelihood is decreased significantly. Do you see the same thing in the startup world?
Sorry, Joe, you broke up a little bit at the end in your audio. So could you paraphrase just that last bit of your question, please?
Yes, I was asking, in the startup world, do you think it's important that founders have either a strong personal or corporate brand before they go into the pitch?
I would say that cuts both ways, right? Because sometimes when you have an overly strong personal brand, it means that you suit very much a particular target audience, but to the others, they may think, oh, you're not the right fit for me. So I would actually have a strong, authentic, consistent personal brand, but always make sure that you leave enough space to be flexible. And the way I do that is for me personally, LinkedIn, you might see me at LinkedIn, or you might see me at a particular summit or conference, and then you reach out to me. I always make it a point to reach out to them via a Zoom chat like this, or a phone call, or face-to-face meeting. Because I think it's in that session where we get to know each other better, and the full nuance and flavors of who we are and what we represent comes out. So I think that needs to be managed with some care. So a strong personal brand that's consistent, clear, authentic, yet at the same time doesn't close too many doors for you. Which is why, for example, when I talk about pitching, and I know there are many misconceptions about pitching, my personal flavor on pitching or even career planning has always been one of an inside-out approach, for example. So I make sure that that is consistently conveyed through my communications. And my definition of pitching, like we started today, is also much broader than just startup investor or venture pitching. Because I truly believe everybody uses pitching every day. And you can be yourself and you can do it without manipulating others. That part is very important to me, that you do it without manipulating others. You do it because there's something of value you can offer and you just want them to understand it better. So they can receive that value. So yeah, I know it's an oblique response, but I hope that answers the
yeah,
question.
it does help answer that. Thank you so much. I guess the last question is, how can people get in touch with you or find out more about what you do?
Yeah, well, drop me a personalized message on LinkedIn. It is, well, linkedin.com/in/Ruo Mei Chua, as in RUOMEICHUA. And I'm sure Joe will provide the deets later
Yes.
on as well.
Yes, I'll
So
include the
feel free to
link.
personalize that note. Tell me maybe one thing that you loved about the exchange between Joe and me today. I would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ruo Mei. I really, really appreciate you sharing your insights. Thank you so much. And if you enjoyed today's
I hope you don't get into trouble with your wife later.
it wouldn't be the first time. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, thank you so much. If you're watching the show and you found this helpful, you want to share these tips with anyone who, you find these very, very valuable, please do so. Otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. See you. Thank you, Joe, again.
Thank you.